Let's take you back to one of our leading stories now. Former President Thabo Mbeki blaming Eskom for load shedding. He claims that the rolling power cuts are not due to government's incompetence, at least at the time that he was in charge. Let's get some reaction now, and we speak to independent energy expert Mohamed Madhi. Mr. Madhi, good evening to you, and thank you for your time. Former President Mbeki saying that the January 2008 load shedding was, and I quote, unnecessary, and to use his words, this was actually engineered from within Eskom. What do you make of those comments? Are they true? Perhaps should be the question.
So good evening to yourself and to the viewers. I think the comments by the former president, obviously, he wouldn't say something in vain, and he's probably got good information to make such claims. From our perspective, it's plausible because the load shedding that occurred in 2008 was quite sudden. One has to understand that. So the extent and the nature of the load shedding was quite sudden, and it was an unusual event back in 2008. Unfortunately, post-2008, it has not been unusual. What is also important to understand is that, we had a load shedding bout in 2008 and 2009, and then it had, to a large extent, tapered off for quite a while. So that does beg some explanation, does beg some investigation. And I don't think that was properly and fully investigated. One should also look back, from 1994 to around about 2003, 2004, Eskom was always ranked in the top 5 in the world in terms of being a utility. So going from being the top 5 in the world to suddenly dropping and having the kind of load shedding we experienced was unusual, even though there was a great deal of economic activity at the time. So it is unusual, it's plausible, but I don't, I think for us on the outside of the deep detail, we can't make a definitive statement about that.
Yeah. The former president is careful to use available data, and that means evidence, at least at his disposal, in order to try and justify why he is saying what he's saying today. And I want to go back to the 1998 electricity white paper. By the way, it's still online, so anyone who wants to find it can go there. There's a specific quote, Mr. Madhi, that I want to quote from that paper, because this is the basis upon which his government failed to heed the warnings, because this is the quote that white paper said at the time, and I quote now, for an assumed demand growth of 4.2%, Eskom's present generation capacity, this is the capacity surplus, will be fully utilized by about 2007. So, in other words, December 2007, that essentially when load shedding started, and I suspect that's what he told, that's when he uses the words localized load shedding. His government failed, did it not?
So let's just be a little bit clear. The load shedding that happened in January 2008, certainly there was a great deal of economic activity, as said. But remember, we had a big boom just prior to the debt crisis of 2008. We had an unprecedented economic boom. And even in South Africa, there were several years of really good growth. And so we did grow out of capacity, but I think plans were in hand by 2009. So I wouldn't like to go back to 1998. I think it's a very important point that you've made, but I wouldn't like to go back and, point fingers there. I think the problem was still in hand. By 2008, even 2008, 2009, the problem was in hand. For me, the biggest failure occurred in 2009, 2010, 2011, when, forgetting just the forecasts that were made back in 1998, we were facing a reality, a real sort of instance of now load shedding. And at that point, that critical juncture, we did not take the action that was supposed to be taken. Remember, had we built the nuclear fleet,
Yeah.
and I'm not talking about the goods or the bads about it, but had we built the nuclear fleet, started building it in 2010, today we would have no electricity problem. So we would have had a surplus of electricity. And that was the more critical failure than the failure to observe the findings of a report back in 1998. I think that was a failure as well, and we must call it for what it was. It was a failure back in 1998. However, it wasn't as severe as the failure that occurred in 2010.
All right. At least I'm glad that we agree on the score of the failure to heed the warnings of the electricity white paper of 1998. Let's then talk about what he says is the self-created crisis of load shedding that then starts in 2008, because he counts the period between those initial stages of load shedding to a 5-6 year period that he says the country was again free of load shedding, which talks to what he says were engineers within Eskom who simply failed to ensure that there was adequate supply of coal to the power station. Is he at least justified in calling that for what it was, a self-created crisis?
I would not call it a self-created crisis. I think we at the point of 2008, the economic growth had caught up with the supply capability of this grid. And the signs that that was going to happen, you pointed out in 1998, but by 2004, already there were signs that this was going to happen. So, even if you didn't take the due action, and I'm not talking of President Mbeki in particular, but whoever the decision makers were, didn't take the necessary action in 1998, there was no doubt action should have been taken by 2004 and certainly by 2010. Now, blaming Eskom engineers, I would certainly not do that in this case. I think there hasn't been the most optimum performance from Eskom, and I think Eskom does share a fair amount of the blame, but the decision-making around new generation capacity goes much higher than the engineers within Eskom. And the engineers within Eskom and various committees and capital expansion committees within Eskom have made suggestions, have made recommendations for new generation capacity for the last 20 years, certainly at the ground level. And those recommendations have, to a large extent, been then overshadowed by various other interests. And that was brought to bear very starkly during the time of President Zuma. So, we have to understand that we had a very abnormal situation during state capture, and that contributed a great deal to the lack of competence and the lack of proper planning that we saw in Eskom.
Yeah. And that lack of proper planning, I think not to belabor the point, because he does talk at length about why it was that multiple packages were then put out for tender in order to build these power stations. He mentions a number of companies that were contracted to build what essentially should have been, I suppose, for him would be a contract given to one contractor to build Kusile, another contractor to build Medupi, as opposed to multiple players, because that then makes the amount of money that is ultimately used to build these power stations astronomical. But let's park that there. I want to go back to your initial point as we close this conversation. The difference between the Eskom build project, that's Kusile and Medupi. Those were the two major power stations that were the guzzlers of money, versus what you suggested in your earlier comment, that the failure for you was the failure to build a nuclear fleet. Do you think that would have been the better option as opposed to Kusile and Medupi?
Look, undoubtedly, in terms of what Kusile and Medupi ended up costing, the nuclear fleet would have been a better solution, providing we had the right funding package. The funding packages at the time were fairly expensive, but had we had the right funding package, and there were funding packages available, then undoubtedly it would have been. We would have also been sitting with surplus capacity at this point, and we would have been very realistically being able to export additional power from South Africa to Southern Africa, thereby helping the whole region and helping our economy in the process as well. So there's no doubt. And green, nuclear energy is also fairly green. So it's a lot cleaner than coal-fired power. And notwithstanding the risk of nuclear fallout, which is very, very limited in Generation 4 nuclear power plants, you have no real environmental impact from nuclear. So compared again to coal-fired power plants. But I must say, just going back to the point of President Mbeki and suggesting that, we have an overall contract for each, he is quite right in that regard. The way the contracts were handled and manipulated and managed on an ongoing basis for Medupi and Kusile undoubtedly led to this extreme overrun in costs and to a large extent, the problems that we sit in today.
Mohamed Madhi, let me thank you very much for your time and analysis. Independent energy expert weighing in on what the former president, Thabo Mbeki, had to say a little earlier about what has been assumed to be the failures of his government to heed the warnings that the country would soon run out of energy.